So once again, let's jump into yet again another Transformer Slag podcast Patreon listener question. If you want to be part of the Transformer Slag Patreon, help support the podcast, let us know we're doing a half-decent job here in the Transformer world, keeping you informed, entertained, and possibly, hopefully, learning something. Patreon.com/Protoman, or check the pinned comment description below. What does that get you if you join the Patreon? Gets your name in the end credit scroll at the end of every segment moving forward. Gets you access to the exclusive Transformer Slag Discord where we break the news, talk about the news, reflect on the Transformer world, share information, share lore, share rare downloads, share sales. The sales is the most important part so we could save money in our hobby. Depending on what tier, you might even get a little gift in the mail or even access to do a Patreon listener question. Again, patreon.com/Protoman. And we got a Patreon listener question today. It's going to be a big one. We got it from Jeff, and Jeff wants to know, and this is a big one. Let's just get into that one, man. Giggity. Jeff wants to know, why didn't the Transformer comic books have the same reach as the 1980s Marvel G.I. Joe comic books did in the 80s? There was an old blog post by former Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter showing that the G.I. Joe books at one point were the best-selling comic book of 1986. And people were also commenting, showing that to prove it with certain sales numbers and stuff like that. Is it simply because Larry Hama was a much better writer than anyone that was put onto the Transformer books? Which is to say now as an adult because the G.I. Joe comic books hold up so well compared to the Transformer ones? Or was it like the case with many of my classmates that we thought it was idiotic that Optimus Prime killed himself over a video game and didn't see fit with it with the Transformer fans in general? I also think it's interesting that the first comment on Jim Shooter's blog was that retailers had G.I. Joe listed as the #1 selling toy of 1986, while Transformers was number 7. Behind mask. Did the movie toys tank sales that bad? Well, there's a lot to unpack here. The one thing I want to tackle right off the bat is the biggest misconception of it all, that somehow we could pinpoint the downfall of Transformers based on the 86 movie. That is not the case at all. I did a segment on the podcast talking about why the 86 movie was not successful and why Transformers kind of saw a decline after that point. There was a lot of things, but the 86 movie just happens to be, part of that timeline of the decline, but not the main reason for it. If anything, the 86 movie would have helped Transformers at some point, but it was a different time, a different place, and there was a lot of other stuff. Check out that segment when you get a moment. I forget what the title was, but it was a Patreon listener question also. But to get into the part about why the comics with G.I. Joe sold so well compared to Transformers, and it's something that I talked about on the Geektasticipher radio show. It wasn't a podcast, it was a radio show where we were talking about when we lived during those brands. I'm a little bit of an older guy. I'm in my 30s. And I lived during that along with He-Man and Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers and all that. And I was talking with the other people on the show that were also the same age group, 80s kids, and how the schoolyard perceived certain brands and their public perceptions, depending on the age demo and stuff like that. If you were a younger kid, it was kind of cool to watch Power Rangers, but if you were an older kid, not so much the case. Obviously time heals all of that, but we're talking in the moment. And it's the same thing when it comes to purchases of toys, or even in the case of the dying brand of purchasing comic books. And G.I. Joe, despite the fact that it was on the shelves and toy aisles with Transformers and He-Man and everything else, always skewed more older when it came to its audience. Yeah, there was tons of kids buying the toys, but there was also a lot of adults that were buying the toys and reading the comics. G.I. Joe, even in 1986, was a 20-year-old brand. It started from the 60s. It had those people from that old part of that brand that still were around and enjoyed consuming it. and especially its fiction. And its fiction skewed a little older. There was a lot of death in those books. There was a lot of, serious issues and stuff like that. It was well written. Larry Hama is a fantastic writer. He would go on to work on the Wolverine books and stuff in the 90s. So it goes to show that, yeah, writing does make a big deal and why a book continues to be successful. But G.I. Joe had a lot of things going for it that just kind of skewed older. And when you skew older, you usually have a more dedicated audience to your comic book subscriptions and stuff like that. And that explains why in 1986, G.I. Joe was the number one selling book at one point for Marvel, where Transformers wasn't really in that kind of thing. And again, I love what Simon Furman did for the Marvel books, but that was almost like too little too late. He came much later in the book, already like past the point of no return in a lot of ways, and really reinvented the wheel in a lot of senses, introducing Primus, bringing in Unicron, and everything like that. The Nightbeat stuff, how he worked with Bludgeon, all that kind of stuff, and Thunderwing. I could go on and on. But literally like issues like 1 up until, I want to say 55, which was more than 50% of the run of the book of its original Marvel G1 run, where it was not Simon. And that's why a lot of the stuff that we celebrate about those books came in the second half, and that's when it was also on its way out in terms of being canceled. The G.I. Joe books were just better. They just were in terms of writing, and had a very dedicated audience. And the second part here that you mentioned about G.I. Joe being the number one retail product in 1986, that one is debatable, because the article that was linked in relation to it being the number one best-selling toy of 1986 was from the Sentinel, which was a newspaper and magazine. And they mentioned that G.I. Joe was the number one best-selling toy due to surveys with retail stores due to units. And that's a very key point there, units as opposed to monetized numbers. Units of sales with G.I. Joe does not surprise me if it's a number one seller compared to Transformers, because G.I. Joe skewed a little cheaper when it came to Transformers. And I mean, just to give you some MSRP numbers back then, to kind of give you an idea, let's start at the top going down. The legendary USS Flag, the biggest piece of Transformers, the biggest piece of G.I. Joe merchandise ever, the couch-sized, aircraft carrier, the golden, everyone wants it if you're a G.I. Joe collector, was $109 USD MSRP back in 1986. The second biggest item was the Cobra Terrordrome at $55.99, and then it just goes down from there, where Fortress Maximus was $100. And I'll tell you something, a complete Fortress Maximus today will run you between $300 and $500, especially with the reissues and stuff. But a complete USS Flag, it's going to run you a lot more, So it's needless to say that Joe's back in the day skewed a little cheaper. And what made the bread and butter of G.I. Joe toys was the individual 3-inch figures. And those were between $2.99 and $3.99 each. And they made up the bulk of what was the shelving of G.I. Joe product. Because stuff like the USS Flag and all those vehicles, they took enough space to begin with. But those single-carded Joe figures were cheap, they were effective, and it just worked for when you had to buy something for a birthday or whatever. It was just the best way to go about it. When you look at the flip side of 1986 for Transformers, we're not in the Bumblebee era anymore. The mini-bots being the cheapest product of the Transformer line, which had Bumblebee, Cliffjumper, and stuff. Those guys aren't even in the lineup anymore. We're in 1986. We have Pipes. We have Outback. We got all the others. Sure, like some of the 1985 guys were carryovers like Warpath and Cosmos, but it wasn't like the heavy hitters. And those guys were equal to their G.I. Joe counterparts. They were $3.99 each MSRP. But the difference between G.I. Joe and Transformers was those mini-bot assortment made up a small percentage of the much larger TF lineup. Those 3-inch G.I. Joes, they had a huge dedicated section to it in the toy shelves. Many people have beautiful photos, I'll post some too, of the toy aisles back in the day. And I have vivid memories of, while G.I. Joe did take up a lot of shelf space, the 3-inch figures were the bread and butter. With Transformers, the mini bot assortment was such a small part of it, where the Autobot car assortment and all the larger stuff really was the bigger focus and took more of the shelf space. So when you're talking Autobot cars in 1986, you're talking Hot Rod Cup, Blur, even some of the 1985 product that spills over. And those guys were between MSRP of $12.99 to $15.99, depending on where you were shopping. And then it just goes up from there. You got stuff like Jetfire at $34.99 and Optimus Prime at $39.99. It got crazy. What I'm trying to get at is Transformers was way more expensive than G.I. Joe. Even G.I. Joe vehicles, the bigger box stuff, like you're talking some of the bigger box vehicle stuff was $7.99 to $10.99, while Hot Rod and Cup would have ran you $12 or $13. Which one do you think a parent's going to buy? That bigger vehicle and a cheaper little 3-inch figure, or this robot that's in the box is considered a lot smaller? Now, obviously, when we break it down from a manufacturing and business standpoint, Hasbro's Transformer product were more expensive than Hasbro's G.I. Joe product. It was a lot more parts, it was a lot more engineering, it was a lot more plastic, there was die cast in some of those figures, so they were more expensive to manufacture, and as a result, they were more expensive on the other side, even though they perceived wise in the box seemed like smaller, cheaper products. But yeah, Joes were just extremely cheaper in comparison to Transformers. And the price of, a lot of Transformer product instead would get you 3 to 4 G.I. Joe figures instead. And that's a lot more appealing to a parent, let alone a child, when a parent could say, hey, you could get 4 of these or 1 of that. And with kids, that's usually how it works. And thus, as a result of this long-winded rant, that's why more units were sold. Way more units were sold. You could brag about like, oh, we just sold, 50 Fortress Maximuses, $100 a pop, and it's like it's $5,000 for that store, but then they'll sell way more carded Joes and the mini play sets and mini vehicles and stuff, and that'll blow that $5,000 out of the sky. Just completely out of the sky. And the other part that you mentioned, too, about it being the #1 toy brand in the United States, well, yeah, it's possible. It's possible considering that, Transformers was much more popular, I think, in other regions outside of the United States. It was probably right up there with G.I. Joe, especially in 1986 when it was on its way out already. But, I mean, in Canada, it was a #1 brand. In UK, there's a great BBC archive video of the #1 toys for the holiday season in 1986, and Transformers was #1. It goes without saying. And that was shared along with He-Man and a whole bunch of others. And G.I. Joe didn't even make the list in the BBC. Granted, that's, Action Force over there, kind of had a different vibe and a different culture. And here in Canada, G.I. Joe was still pretty popular too, but it was always a distant second to Transformers, where I think He-Man kind of even fit in between there. He-Man was more popular than G.I. Joe in Canada. But, I mean, it goes without saying that Joes were cheaper, and thus they were the more preferred birthday purchase and stuff like that. And, long story short, TFs were way more expensive. And it's even more apparent when 1987 and 1988 rolled around, when Ninja Turtles came out. And Ninja Turtles price structured themselves very similar to G.I. Joe, where they were a cheaper price point for the individual figures. And by the time Turtles came out in 87, 88, completely destroyed Transformers' interest for children in that market and became the #1 toy going out of the 80s, and definitely became a cultural phenomenon going into the 90s. And, I mean, let's not even talk about the video game reboot and revival that Nintendo started around that time, too, which made sales go in different directions. G.I. Joe fans skewed older, and because they skewed older, they focused more on G.I. Joe. Transformer fans usually skewed younger, and they just moved on to whatever the next thing was. So that's what usually creates that longevity. Now, of course, when we look at the bigger picture now, all these years later, obviously G.I. Joe is having a tough time modernizing, where Transformers, no pun intended, transformed and constantly reinvented itself to survive during the 90s with Beast Wars, and then, of course, changing itself completely to work with the mainstream audience and the Michael Bay movies and stuff like that. Where G.I. Joe, it just couldn't find its footing today in a more globalized world and stuff like that. And I think that that's also combined with the fact that now we are in a globalized world, and now the UK fans and the Canadian fans, along with the American fans, and let's not leave out Japan. Japan loves Transformers way more than G.I. Joe. You combine all of those, and you're just going to have an audience that just wants more Transformers than G.I. Joe product. But yeah, there probably was at one time when G.I. Joe was riding high because it was good stuff. That old Joe cartoon, fantastic. I love that Joe cartoon. Those comics are fantastic too. They really are. But there's just the, when it comes to the units sold thing, that's the one where it's like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but also Joe toys were way cheaper. And I'm not saying in terms of quality, I'm talking in terms of how much it cost to sell them. And the Transformers were just way more expensive. A kid would have maybe 5 or 6 Transformer toys, but he'd have like 12 to 30 G.I. Joes and a giant play set and a whole bunch of weapon packs and stuff like that. It was just so much easier, way much easier. That's the same reason of the success of something like Hot Wheels, because of how cheap it is per unit to own a car in Hot Wheels, and why a kid can end up with 50 Hot Wheels toys and a Hot Wheel track. So it's what made Ninja Turtles succeed, and then that weird kind of environment that happened then afterwards with Power Rangers, where Power Ranger toys were much more expensive, and the Zords, oh my god, let's not even get into the prices of the Zords and how difficult they were to get, where Power Rangers kind of almost entered back into that Transformer era of difficulty of price and availability, but was very popular with kids. Today, kids don't buy anything, and it's all us crazy adults buying it, so it doesn't make a difference in the end. And I think that might explain what's steering the ship in a lot of ways. We literally had this discussion with Aaron Archer in one of our streams, where we were talking about how the toy industry today is more about collectability and realism for an adult market than it is the toyetic play value for a younger generation, because toy companies recognize that kids in general don't really buy toys anymore. But we're getting off onto a whole other topic. I hope that kind of answers it a little bit. There's so much to unpack here, because we have to dive back into the history of that, and it's something that just one segment alone could not cover. But I hope it kind of gives a general starting point. And again, the 86 movie, I really feel, was not the biggest turning point in terms of Transformers' downfall. There was a lot of things that were going, usually in general. Every toy line has a good 3-year window of success, and then it kind of just fades away for the next thing to become popular. Kids get bored, and then they move on to the next thing. He-Man was the same thing. It saw record sales in 1986, and then it all just tanked out after the She-Ra release afterwards. And that's a whole other discussion for a whole other podcast, for a whole other topic, for a whole other toy line that does not belong here. But anyways, hope that answers your question, Jeff, and hope you guys learned something from it, and maybe we could open up the can of worms more on this in the future, maybe in a future stream or something where we're not confined to just a couple of minutes to discuss something, and we could have a full 2 to 3 hours to talk about it with some industry professionals that might have touched the brand also. But if you want to be part of the Patreon, help support the podcast, much like Jeff here, ask some questions, or just want to hang out in the Discord, or just want to help support the podcast, again, patreon.com/protoman. Check the pinned comment or the description below, and rock out with the robots in the skies.